The following lecture has been recorded live by Jewish Multimedia Library, Incorporated. To download and listen to many of our other recordings, please visit our website www.jml.org.au. Please consult your local rabbi for any matter pertaining to halachic practice and observance.
Here we are, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to Bet Haroah and Mizrachi for hosting this occasion. Thank you to the JCCV and B'nai Akiva for helping with the publicity and for sponsoring the event. A very special thank you to the family of Arnold Bloch, Zichrona Livracha, in whose memory this series of shiurim, these series of lectures are being given. And very appropriately so, because amongst Arnold Bloch's many interests were a passion for this synagogue, a passion for learning, a passion for Jewish continuity, which is tonight's topic. And thank you especially to Dean Ellenson, my manager, who makes these things happen. About 4 years ago, a very important and very valuable statistical report was published into the state and the future of the Jewish community of Australia, in particular in Sydney and Melbourne. And it was called the Gen 08 survey. One of its principal researchers is here tonight. And it provided a huge amount of data. Probably in terms of its, the amount of data per capita, it was unprecedented in the history of Jewish demography. And since then, since it was originally published in 2009, reports have been coming out bit by bit, analysing different parts of the data. And the first one that came out some time ago was on the subject of Jewish continuity. And part of what I want to say tonight is, in a sense, a response and in a sense, a critique of what that report said. Because I want to talk about what the report did say, what the report didn't say, and then also what the report did say, but in a rather funny way. Let me start with what the report did say. It talked, amongst many other things, about the state of intermarriage and its implications for Jewish continuity. And it said it's pretty bad. That we're up to, at least in the key demographic, that's the 25 to 35-year-olds, we're up to 40% intermarriage. And that doesn't take into account cohabiting couples, which probably puts the number up, probably with some significance. We're way behind America. America's way over 50%, so are many places in Europe, but we're catching up. And what does this mean? Well, it means something pretty bad. Let me say at this stage that, of course, marrying out, and I will call it marrying out, doesn't always mean the end of the Jewish line. I acknowledge, and I have tremendous respect and admiration for couples where one party is Jewish and the other is not, who raise their children as Jews. I know a number of such families, and it certainly can be done, and it does happen. And I have tremendous respect, particularly for the non-Jewish partner in such a marriage, for enabling their children to grow up with a Jewish identity. But having said that, it must also be acknowledged that most of the time, that's not what happens. If you look at the data coming out of the United States, where there is a vast number of intermarried families, and if you look at different reports, you get very different answers to this question of how many children of an intermarried couple go up with a Jewish identity. In my opinion, you get very different answers because it's very much the case that the bias of the researcher comes through in this research, because everyone's got a vested interest in what the answer is. But it seems to me that even from the most, if you like, tolerant of intermarriage, you get a figure of 1/3. Of 1/3 of children out of intermarried unions grow up with a sense of a Jewish identity, and 2/3 do not. What does that mean for a community? Well, doing the maths, if 40% marry out, 60% don't, and of those 40%, 2/3 grow up to have children with no Jewish identity and 1/3 do, then the very best you're going to keep is 75% in each generation. That means in 2 generations, approximately, you've halved the number of Jews in the community. Of course, it wouldn't be like that because these things have a habit of snowballing, and the second generation would probably be hit a lot worse than the first generation. And you'd lose a lot of people. Now let me say also, I don't weep for the numbers on a big scale. I don't weep even for the communities that will disappear. That's the nature of Jewish life. For 1,000 years, the center of Jewish life was on the banks of the Tigris in Surah and Pumbedita in modern-day Iraq, and those places have completely disappeared. And we don't weep for that. That's the nature of Jewish life. We move on, and one day Melbourne and Sydney will move on as well. But I do weep for the individual Jews, for the Jews whom we are losing to Jewish life, to Jewish engagement, to Judaism. Now, we've been here before. In about the year 1900, at the time of Federation, there were approximately 7,000 Jews in Melbourne. Interestingly enough, if those Jews had carried on having Jewish children, even at a rate of stability, 2 Jewish parents have 2 Jewish children, which is the average, then we would expect to find at very minimum 7,000 descendants of Jews from that period living amongst us today. We don't. We know 1 or 2 families who can trace their origins back to that period, 100 years ago, but we don't know 7,000 such families, or 7,000 such Jews. And the reason for that is very simple, because at that time, there was an intermarriage rate which by 1930 had reached 30%. And had it not been for the influx of Jews from Europe, then the Jewish community of Melbourne would have ceased to exist. In 1970, which was another time when surveys were done and estimates were made, again, the intermarriage rate was about 30%. And it seems to me that had it not been for the influx of Jews from South Africa at that time, then again we would have been on an inevitable decline. With the intermarriage rate today at about 40%, and there's no new mass immigration on the horizon, I think we're going to be looking at a very different Jewish community in 1 generation and certainly in 2 generations' time. Now, the sub-question, the subtext of tonight's talk is, why do we care about this? One of the things that the report, the Gen 08 survey, didn't say, and I've checked again and again, and if I've missed something I apologize, but it seemed to me that it didn't answer the question of why is this a bad thing? It talked about the level of intermarriage, and it talked about what we can do about it. And it clearly was worried. It clearly said this is not a good situation to be in. But nowhere did it say, why is this not a good situation to be in? And that is a very important question. I mean, it's a very important question because obviously a lot of people are choosing to intermarry. Or to be more accurate, and this is really the point, they're not choosing to marry Jewish. So obviously there's some sort of debate going on. Is it important to marry Jewish? Is it not important to marry Jewish? And that's going to be really what I want to address tonight. But more to the point, it seems to me that the absence of an answer to that question is precisely the problem and is precisely the cause of the crisis, and it is a crisis, in which we now find ourselves. Now, we've been speaking to different age audiences. I spoke to school students, I spoke to uni students and 20-year-olds. I'm now speaking to older people. Oh, sorry, that didn't come out right. I'm now speaking to a mature, experienced, seasoned... No, I'll stop here. Anyway. And I have to say, the next bit that I'm about to say, I felt very awkward talking to the 20-somethings along these lines, but I feel slightly less awkward now, but not completely so. But what I wanted to say was, how do relationships happen? How do intermarriages happen? Now, there are some people who go out there saying, I don't want to marry somebody who's not Jewish. I've had enough of all this Jewishness. To which I haven't really got very much to say. That's obviously their choice, and that's what they're going to do. There are a lot of people who say to themselves, you know, it's probably a good idea to marry somebody Jewish, and I probably will. But they go out to university, and they go to the workplace, and they find somebody who, as it happens, is not Jewish, and a relationship starts up, and it turns out they marry them. I believe, pretty unscientific, but I believe that's how most intermarriages happen. Because people meet somebody who is very nice and very pretty and very nice to be in a relationship with and happens not to be Jewish. Now, how can that be avoided? Why does it not happen for the other 60%? Partly it's a fluke. Sometimes you meet somebody Jewish, sometimes you meet somebody non-Jewish. But bear in mind that in Melbourne we are 1% of the population, so you've got 99 times more likely to meet somebody who's not Jewish than to meet somebody who is Jewish. Why do the 60% meet somebody and stay with somebody Jewish? And the answer is because it's a question of how important is it to make sure that one's partner is somebody who's Jewish. Sometimes when I have this discussion in my own school, people say, but you can't control whom you fall in love with. Well, actually you can. Because there are a lot of people who would say, for instance, if I fall in love with somebody who happens to be married to somebody else, I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to stop there. I think most people would do that, I'm pleased to say. However, for many people today, drawing that same line at somebody who happens not to be Jewish is not important enough to make such an effort. And the reality of that situation is the crisis we're currently facing. And the very fact that we don't stand up and say why 40% intermarriage is a crisis, why it's a bad thing, is itself the problem. Because until we can tell our young people why it matters, then we're not going to help them make it important enough to make sure that it doesn't happen. So why might it be important? Well, some people say it's important but there are lots of Jews, and if there are fewer Jews, that's a bad thing. I don't buy that. And by the way, nor does God. I hesitate before speaking on behalf of God, but when he has written down in his book, we are allowed to rely on that. And he wrote in his book, in Pasha Ve'et Chanan, I don't love you because you are many. In fact, you are amongst the smallest of peoples. It's not about how many Jews there are that makes us better. It's not a popularity contest. It's not a vote that more Jews makes us somehow righter than if there were fewer Jews. That's not what it's about. And whether there are lots of Jews, whether there are few Jews, that doesn't matter. Some want to say that if there are lots of Jews, then we have more lobbying power, and lots of Jews is the way to ensure that the government of Australia stays friendly to the state of Israel. I think that's pretty pathetic, basically. To tell a young person that they should marry somebody just so we can carry on lobbying the Australian government, I think is asking a bit too much of them. And by the way, I think the Australian government supports Israel because Israel is worth supporting, like the Australian government supports lots of other countries which don't necessarily have any lobbying bloc. And by the way, we don't either, because there are very few of us to start with. So I think that's a bit of a silly argument. And then sometimes we're told that it's important that there are lots of Jews so that we can carry on with our fundraising efforts to keep the Jewish institutions going, which is obviously a rather circular argument. But people do seriously make that argument. We must make sure that there's another Jewish generation so that we can raise funds off them to run our shuls and schools and so on. Well, I think we can see the circularity of that argument, obviously. I don't think those arguments are good enough. And I think we have a major problem when we tell our young people, you must stay Jewish, you must choose a Jewish partner, but we don't tell them why. Sometimes, particularly where I come from, or rather in my position, I hear complaints from young Jews leaving school that they are Jewed out. Actually, you hear it more in Sydney as it happens, but you hear it here as well. That after 18 years of a Jewish day school, of a Jewish youth group, of a Jewish social crowd, they're Jewed out, and because they're Jewed out, they rush to university and they rush into the company and sometimes into the arms of the first non-Jewish person they can find. I have to say, I used to be very, very critical of that argument. I used to say as follows: if I want to binge on chocolate, which sometimes I do, I will do that because I like chocolate, not because I've had too many messages about healthy eating, that it's pushed me into the chocolate. And I think, to some extent, the same applies to what we're dealing with here. However, I've reflected on that, and I think perhaps that's unfair. Because if we raise a generation of Jews and we tell them you must stay in this Jewish fold, but we don't tell them why, then it's not surprising that they end up Jewed out and say, I don't see why I should bother to stick to a Jewish social crowd. I don't see why I should bother to stick to engagement with the Jewish community. And above all, I don't see why I should bother to have a Jewish partner, because we haven't told them otherwise. So let me come up with what might be some better reasons why not. And let me start talking about the Jewish values that make our lives special. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that we are the only people who have worthy values, that we are the only culture and race and religion who have values that are worth maintaining, worth passing on. I do think perhaps we have a special, maybe unique combination of these values, and I think they are worth preserving. We're the people who discovered one God. Now, what does it mean to have one God? Without being too religious about it, what does it mean when Avraham Avinu, as the Midrash says, smashed the idols, and we called the Ivrim, the Hebrews, because he stood on one avar, one side of the world, and said, whatever you want to do, you want your polytheistic religions, that's up to you, but I'm going to do something different. Why does that matter? It matters in the following way. Because if we live in a world of many gods, then it's very easy to find one God in our image. When there's only one God, we have to be in his image. And that's the difference between Judaism as created by Abraham, the monotheism, and the paganism that went before. That's why the Torah is so obsessed with the prohibition of idolatry, because idolatry, as the Rambam says, is man-centered religion. One God means we have to subjugate ourselves to a higher moral authority. We're the people who gave the world the idea of freedom. When we came out of Egypt, when we left that slavery, and we taught the world about how to treat individuals and how to treat each other, we talked about freedom and we talked about responsibility. We have the idea that we are able to take charge of our own destiny, to make decisions for ourselves, to choose the right and to choose the wrong. We have the moral autonomy, and yes, we have the moral responsibility to make those changes in our lives. We give ourselves the challenge of making ourselves better people. We have the idea of teshuvah, of repentance, which means we have the opportunity to create ourselves anew. We have strong communities. We have strong family life. We have festivals, we have events in our life cycle and in our annual cycle which tell us what sort of people we can be. These are values worth preserving. These are values worth making sure there is a continuity of. But you know what? I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough, principally for a functional reason, because many people can say in response to that, well, I can still preserve those values, whatever type of life I live, and whomever I choose to marry. And now this brings me to the point that the report, the Gen 08 survey, did say, but in a funny way. Not very funny, but odd. It said, if you look at the data, there's a very clear correlation between those families who have greater degrees of religious observance and those families which are more likely for their children to marry in and less likely for their children to marry out. In other words, it's religious life which is, I can't use the word guarantor, but certainly increases the likelihood of Jewish continuity. And then it said, but obviously that's not going to work for most families, so forget that. And that's what I mean by what the report did say, but in a peculiar fashion. Having actually found the answer to the question of how do we ensure Jewish continuity, it then dismisses it and says that's obviously not relevant. I stand here tonight because I believe that religious observance, connection to the Jewish religion, is not only a guarantor of Jewish continuity, it's the only one that's ever worked in the past. And I believe it's the only one that can ever work now. I think the evidence is very clear that alternatives have never worked in the past. It's not a new phenomenon that Jews have been leaving organized religion. Jews have been adopting, let's call it secularism. although obviously that term is a vast concept and there's many, many degradations of that. But basically, from very roughly the last 250 years, from the beginning of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Emancipation, we've seen Jews leaving religion. And of course today, we know in our community, there are many, many people, perhaps even a majority of our community, who would identify themselves as not particularly religious or even proudly secular. But I wonder how many secular Jews there are whose parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents were also secular Jews. And my hunch is not very many. In other words, if we find secular Jews today, invariably, you don't have to go back very many generations before you get to religious Jews. What's the point of that? The point is that you don't find, except in very rare cases, you don't find secular Jews after 8 generations. You know why? Because they don't carry on being Jewish after 8 generations. If you go back to those families who started leaving religion 250 years ago, and you ask where are their children, their descendants today, I don't think you find very many in the organized Jewish community today. It used to be said, as a sort of joke, but not a very funny one, what do you call the grandchildren of intermarried Jews? And the answer, according to the joke, was Christians. Today, I don't think that's accurate. What do you call the grandchildren of intermarried Jews? You call them people about whom you read in the newspaper, or you read the biography of some celebrity or some politician, but they are of Jewish origin. That's what you call the grandparents, the grandchildren of intermarried Jews, but I think it also applies to the descendants of secularized Jews. And I'm sorry if this is painful, I'm sorry if this is hard-hitting and sounds judgmental, that's not my intention. I'm looking at the reality. And the reality is that when Jews leave the framework of religious observance, it becomes very likely, not definite, but very likely, that within 2 or 3 generations, their descendants will not be Jewish. And so I say that if we want to increase our chances of Jewish continuity, then the only way, at least outside of Israel, inside of Israel I think is a different case, and even then what's going to happen in the next 100 years is obviously very much an open question. But outside of Israel, I don't think there is any substitute for Jewish observance, for religious observance, to give reasons, to give meaning to our children and our grandchildren to want to carry on being Jewish. And there's another reason, not necessarily functional, not necessarily practical, but philosophical. What is the real reason why Jewish continuity is important? What is the real reason why we want our children, our grandchildren to be Jewish? Because we think being Jewish is important. And it's important not just because it's nice, and not just because our parents and grandparents did it, but because ultimately there's no escaping from the real truth that being Jewish means to be the bearer of a heritage that goes back to Sinai. To be part of a covenant with God. And the covenant works on a basis, if I can simplify it to a great degree, it works on the basis that God continues to look after us if we continue to do our bit, which is basically to try and live as Jews. And we think that's important, and we think that's worthwhile, and we think that governs our lives, and we think it's worth directing and guiding the lives of our children and grandchildren. Now, if we think all that, what do we do about it? Am I saying that we have to all become Haredim? Am I saying that we all have to immediately adopt every possible Jewish practice? No, I'm not saying that. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't actually think from the point of view of what I'm talking about that's necessary. But I do think that if we are serious about wanting our children to marry Jewish, we're wanting to have Jewish grandchildren, we have to show our children that it's important. As I said earlier, why are we in this state? Why are we in this crisis of intermarriage? I believe that the key answer is that our children don't realize the importance of preserving their Jewish identity, their Jewish practice, and ensuring their own, that the homes that they build become Jewish as well. So how do we show them that importance? And I would say there's a 5-point plan I'd like to share with you. To learn, to do, to commit, to connect, and to love. So let me start with the learning. And it's appropriate I start with the learning because in my mind that's the key to everything. You know, Fiddler on the Roof is a great film. It's got great songs. It's a fascinating story about Jewish continuity, by the way. But there's something in it I really don't like. And we're suffering from it. And when I say Fiddler on the Roof, by the way, I mean the film and the show. I don't mean the original book by Shalom Aleichem, which was very different in this respect. Because in the film, you've got Tevye walking around his barn, I'm not quite sure why, but never mind, and he's talking to God, or talking to the camera, as he does. And in the book, by the way, he didn't talk to the camera, obviously, and he quoted all sorts of Gemaras and Mishnahs and Psukim, which he doesn't in the film. It's very different. Even though the book was written by Shalom Aleichem, who was a great secular Jewish writer, the Tevye in the book is a Talmud Chacham, a great scholar, compared to the Tevye in the film. So the Tevye in the film says, I was going to do the voice, but I won't. He says, you may ask by me, why do we do these things? Why do we wear fringes on the corners of our garments? Why do we wear hats? And I will tell you, I don't know. That's what he says. And then he sings a song, which is sort of the answer to the question, even though he said, I don't know the answer. But he said, I will answer it in one word. And we all know the word, and we all know the song. And don't worry, I'm not going to break into song. Thank you very much, producers and scriptwriters and actors of Fiddler on the Roof. Rubbish, I say. We do know why we wear fringes on the corners of our garments. Because we read it in last week's Sedra. And we say it every day, twice a day, in the third paragraph of the Shema. Because it's a mitzvah in the Torah. And if we learn the Gemara Menachos, we can understand the details of that mitzvah. We don't have to say, I don't know. And you know why we keep mitzvot? And why we have minhagim and why we have various practices and customs? Not just because it's tradition. Not because of tradition. But because these mitzvot, these practices, are part of a profound, intellectual, systematic approach to answering the question of how do we serve God in this world. And if we're not sure of the answer, if like Tevye we're tempted to say, I don't know, the response is not to sing a song, but the response is to go out and learn. And we live in an age where we are so blessed, but there is no impediment to our learning at all. We have a vast library of books, all now translated into English, with clear annotations and explanations. And we have the power of the internet to deliver shiurim and information straight into our own computer. I have to say, fortunately, there is no excuse for somebody who wants to remain ignorant. There is no need to remain ignorant. There is no need for our Jewish education to remain on the level of primary school where we learn Bible stories and we dismiss them like fairy tales. Because we can access teachers and educators and books and internet shiurim and everything we can possibly need so we can answer Tevye's question and we can say, yes, I know. I know why we do these things. I know why they are important. You know why? Because they make sense. Because they're part of the system, and I understand the system. And even if there are bits of it I don't understand, because there's a vast amount of Jewish learning out there, at least I understand that there is a system, there is a logic. And those values that I was talking about before, I know where they come from. And I can understand what the Torah is telling me. And I can understand on a serious, intellectual, profound level. And just as my general education grows year by year, and I go to degree level and tertiary degree and postdoc and so on, so my Jewish learning also doesn't have to remain stagnated in the childhood phase. If we learn, we understand, and if we understand, things become important. They become real. They don't just become tradition. They become something that speaks to me and something that makes sense to me. So number one is to learn. Number two is to do. I talked a little while ago about various values that I think come out of Jewish learning, come out of Jewish life. But it's important to understand that what makes our approach to values special, I think, is that we do not leave them as abstract ideas. We articulate them, we act them out. So we talk about freedom, but we don't just talk about freedom. We have a festival every year dedicated to celebrating that freedom. We don't just talk about the story of the Exodus, we reenact it, and we eat all sorts of funny foods that go along with it, and we call that Seder night, and for many people it's the highlight of their Jewish year. We don't just talk about freedom as individuals. Once a week, we deliberately desist from showing our mastery over the world around us. Once a week, we leave the world in exactly the same state as we find it. And once a week, we also not only stop being masters over the world, we stop being slaves to the technology and all the stuff around us, and so we can have one day a week dedicated to being human beings and being with our family, with our friends, with our community, with our God. And if we don't actually act that out, then the idea is left abstract and meaningless. I mentioned we have strong family life. Doesn't always happen, as we know. Doesn't always work out, but often it does, and it's something of a hallmark of Jewish life. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. When we say at the chuppah, the first bracha we say at the chuppah is Hashem has commanded us about forbidden and permitted relationships. And it's our sexual ethics which underpins the Jewish life, the family life that we have. In my opinion, you cannot have one without the other. We can't just talk about the abstract ideas, we do them. And part of those values is to be a good person. But we don't just leave it in some vague, be a good person for everyone to work out for themselves, and we know that some people's idea of a good person is very different from others. We say, you know what it means to be a good person? It means never to steal. Some people think, big deal, nobody steals. But when it means never steal, that means don't download something which has got copyright. It means don't borrow a pencil without permission. That's what it means. That's how we be a good person. We're committed to telling the truth. Most people are. But the Torah says, you want to tell the truth, it means tell the truth all the time. You tell the truth to the insurance assessor. You tell the truth to the teacher about why the homework's late. You tell the truth to the teacher about why your child got to school late, even when the child's begging you to say something else. That's what it means to make these values real. And that's why if we want to show our children that they are important, we have to demonstrate that they are important to us by doing. But then this brings me to the third point. Is it required to do everything? No, I've already said that and I will reiterate that. But I think it is required to show ourselves and our children that things really matter, and sometimes they matter to the extent of being absolutely non-negotiable. Let me give an example which I think we can all recognize, and then we can all translate it to our own personal experience, which may be different, our own personal situation. There are families in this town, there are many families in this town, for whom Friday night, Shabbat, with the Kiddush and the Challah and all the works, is a very, very important part of their week. And it's wonderful. And of course, Shabbat goes on for more than Friday night. Shabbat actually lasts for 25 hours. But I think it's wonderful that for so many families, Friday night meal, usually with 3 generations together, is such an important part of their life. And I know families for whom they would never miss a Friday night meal with their family unless Carlton's playing at the MCG. And if Carlton's playing at the MCG, well, on a Friday night, well, then on those occasions, they'll go to the match. And as I say, we can smile at that example, and I think most people in this room can say that's not where we are, but we should translate it into where we are, because we all have that point. We all have that point of how do we balance the competing requirements. If somebody makes Friday night very important, but makes Carlton more important than that, then they are telling their children that nothing Jewish is important. Because even the one thing which dominates their Jewish life, the Friday night, even that comes second to going to Carlton. They're telling their children that nothing about being Jewish matters. And certainly, they're telling their children that their children should never make sacrifices, should never have to put what aside something they particularly want to do, or whom they particularly want to marry for the sake of their Jewish life. Because the parents have made very clear that the Jewish life is less important than a footy team. Now, I've now lived in Australia for 6.5 years. I know that footy teams are equivalent to God, but in terms of telling our children about the importance of their Jewish life, we have to make sure we get our priorities right. Now, for some people it will be Friday night versus Carlton. For other people it will be how much of an effort they make to get to Shacharit in the morning. For some people it will be how much of an effort they make to get to Ma'ariv in the evening, which somehow seems to be much harder. Never mind. For some people it will be how much of an effort they make to keep up with Daf Yomi. And for other people it will be how much of an effort they make to fill their week at some stage with some Jewish learning. We all have those points where we negotiate. And what I'm saying is if we want to tell our children that being Jewish is important, then we have to at least find one thing which is so important that it is non-negotiable. Always. Every time. And the fourth thing I want to say is the need to connect. I haven't mentioned that part of the issue about intermarriage is not just about Jewish observance, not just about the future of the community, it's about some concept which is very hard to define, which is a little bit of a conundrum, but that concept is called the Jewish people. And the sad fact is that when one marries out, it is likely that one is leaving the Jewish people. And it is likely, as I said at the beginning, that one's children will not be part of the Jewish people. And I think part of our response to that has to be to say, you know what? We are part of the Jewish people. Of course, we are Australians. Of course, we are loyal citizens of Australia. How can we reconcile that with having some sort of connection, loyalty to other countries, other peoples? My answer is we can. I mean, we ask this question, but it's actually quite easy to answer. We sing Advance Australia Fair, we sing Hatikva in that order. We handle this apparent contradiction. We handle it quite easily. So even from the point of view of being proud and loyal Australians, we can relate to Jewish people around the world because they are Jewish. If Jews are in trouble somewhere around the world, we should feel their pain. If Jews are rejoicing somewhere around the world, we should rejoice with them. And of course today, the clearest manifestation of this idea of the Jewish people is found in the state of Israel. And our connection to the people, the land and the state of Israel is the way we show our understanding that we are part of something called the Jewish people. That idea, by the way, is under attack. There are many young people, we can see this very clearly in America, and I think it's coming here as well, who are disconnecting, who are disaffiliating from Zionism, from Israel. And sometimes they will say, the reason we are disconnecting from Israel is because we don't like what Israel does. I think it's the other way around. I think they don't like what Israel does is because they are uncomfortable with the concept of a Jewish people, a tribal identity, if you like. And that leads them to conclude that they don't like what Israel does. To put it another way, this is not a political talk, and I don't want to get into the whole discussion of the media bias that tells us terrible things about Israel. But let me just say this. Why is it for most of us that we open the Age and we turn on the television and we know to be very critical and very analytical of what the papers write because we know that the story is likely to be distorted, if not a pack of outright lies? The reason for that is because we come from a position of loving Israel, of knowing Israel, of feeling that connection to Israel. That comes first, and we use that sense to analyze what we're being told in the media. If it weren't for that sense of loving Israel, that connection to Israel, then we would actually believe that stuff. And we'd end up, like most of the world today, thinking Israel's some pariah state. What we need to give to our children, and we need to demonstrate it ourselves, is to show that because we are connected to Jewish people around the world, because we are part of an entity called the Jewish people, which is particularly centered today in Israel, we have that connection and we have that love for Israel. And from that starting point, then we can analyze what Israel's doing. Is it really the worst country in the world, or is it actually in many ways the best country in the world? And the fifth thing, and the final thing I want to put on this list is love. I'm not talking about loving one's children. That goes without saying, and it's not the topic tonight. I'm talking about loving being Jewish. You know, I think we all do that, but I don't think we say it often enough. In fact, I don't think we say it very often at all. I think too often our children hear negativity, hear us complaining, hear us saying, oh, the price of meat is so expensive, and the people in Israel are so rude, and the Jewish shops are so bad. And when it comes to mitzvot, there are many of them, and don't get me started on second day Yom Tov. We talk very critically and very negatively about our Jewish life. Now, of course, it's okay because we love it. It's just the things we say. But it's the things that other people hear. It's the things that our children hear. You know, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked, why is it that so many Jews who came to America at the turn of the last century and struggled to maintain Jewish life, they were the ones who, when told, if you don't come to work in the sweatshop on Saturday, you might as well not come back on Monday for another job, and they were the ones who didn't go on Saturday, and on Monday they looked for another job. Why is it that so many of their children didn't maintain the same ways? Why so many of their children became secularized or not Jewish? And Rav Moshe said the answer was because these people who sacrificed so much and struggled so hard to maintain their Jewish life, they did it with a sigh, and they did it with a groan, and the children heard the groan, and the children heard the sigh. If we think being Jewish is important, we must ask ourselves why. And it's because it tells us those wonderful values that guide our lives. It gives meaning to our lives. At the end of the day, there's a core truth to what it is to be Jewish. And it gives beauty to our lives. And we need to tell our children about the beauty, about the meaning, about what it gives us. And perhaps we need to tell our children less, a lot less, about the difficulties, and sometimes about the sacrifices we have to make. I don't know what it's like to have Jewish grandchildren. I recently married off two of my sons. Wonderful simcha for my wife and me. And they're not in the room, so I can say, you know, we don't know when Jewish grandchildren are going to come. No pressure. We're not counting the minutes. But I hope it happens, and I hope it'll be wonderful for us, because I'm told that having Jewish grandchildren is a wonderful thing. Nobody's guaranteed how their children will turn out. Nothing I've spoken about gives that guarantee. And we all know that many families can do the very, very best, but sometimes the children make their own decisions and they make what I think we can call the wrong decision. And by the way, we know the converse is true as well. But there are families which don't give the best messages to their children, and yet the children turn out to be very, very proud and very committed to their Jewish life, and they're the ones who are the mainstays of the next generation. However, from a statistical point of view, we do know what makes the difference. We are currently, I believe, in a state of crisis. I don't think there's going to be a European or a South African immigration to Australia, and I think the 40% intermarriage is going to halve the size of our community within 1 or 2 generations, and I think it's going to be a very different generation, very different Jewish community. And I cry for those Jews whom we will lose, and who will lose what it is for them to be Jewish. But there are things that we can do. Number one, we have to care. We have to realize it's a problem, and we have to understand why it's a problem. We have to understand what we and our children are in danger of losing. And we have to show our children by showing ourselves that being Jewish is important. And I hope I've given a few ways in which we can do that. And if we succeed in doing that, then it becomes much more likely that we can all enjoy the beauty of having Jewish grandchildren. Thank you very much. We now have some time for questions, and I welcome all sorts of questions. I would ask people to keep their questions brief. I'm the one making the speeches tonight, okay? So other people, if they've got questions rather than speeches, please feel very welcome. Yes?
If I may clarify one thing that you said earlier, I thought
Please clarify.
Or ask you to clarify. You said that there's a lot of people that you respect where there's couples where one's Jewish, one's not bringing Jewish kids. You didn't state whether that was a Jewish mother or not.
No, I didn't, and that was deliberate because I didn't want to get into that. Obviously, there was a huge difference. Obviously, if it's a Jewish mother, the children are 100% Jewish, and the marriage or the union having taken place, we want to do everything to keep those children as part of the Jewish community. If the father's Jewish and the mother's not, then let's just say it's different, without getting further into that. Something else I didn't talk about, which is conversion. And let me just mention that now, because it might have been an omission that people feel was an omission. The dire picture I was painting was in the case where there's no conversion, where the union is drifting away and is no longer connected to Jewish life, and the children are no longer connected to Jewish life. Obviously, in the case where somebody converts, that's very different. I would draw a distinction between people who convert for the right reasons and sincerely, and learn and do and practice, and are thereby empowered, and become able to indeed build a real Jewish home with their originally Jewish partner, and to raise Jewish children. And we all know, by the way, of some very, very fine people who have joined our community and have added a tremendous amount to our community, and have added tremendous amounts of Jewish continuity. One of my greatest teachers, whom I'm in touch with and is a great friend and teacher of mine, was not born Jewish. He changed his name from William James Robinson to Yehuda Rubenstein. And the community has always been enriched by people like that. There are people who convert just for the sake of marriage, and that's not necessarily so productive. That was your first question. Your second question.
My second question is, what I this week had two non-religious friends who both said that their boys don't want to marry Jewish. What do you do? They're not religious themselves, so they're not going to offer some of the things. What do you do to these kids? What do you offer them? How do you answer that?
In practice, sorry to sound defeatist or minimalist, you probably can't. And I haven't been in that. No, actually, I have. I have once been in that situation where a parent has come to me and said, "Rabbi, please speak to my child." I haven't. Only once. There are people who do it regularly, and I think most of them will tell you, if they're honest, it almost never works. Almost never works. And the truth is, because once a young person has decided this is the person they want to marry, even before that. Okay, once a young person has been, even before that, if they've been brought up in a way that being Jewish is not particularly important, not particularly meaningful, not particularly true, then it is unlikely that they will see much point in carrying on. I talked about being Jewed out, and I said I've actually got some sympathy with that position. If we've told people, you must marry Jewish, but we've never told them why, then they're fully entitled to say, I don't want to. As I say, 99% of the people you meet in Melbourne are not Jewish. Only 1% are Jewish. I'm not going to comment on which group is the prettier sort, but some people want to marry non-Jewish people. And if they haven't been given those reasons, then it's very hard to persuade them otherwise. I suppose the best I can offer is the sort of things I was talking about, is give them reasons why it's important. And for me, the first thing I put on the list is learning. Because if you think being Jewish is just a tradition, or just a culture, or just the type of food that you eat and occasionally the type of music you listen to, then there is no reason that you have to marry somebody who eats the same food and hears the same music. No reason at all. So you make a face as if to say, well, learning's not going to.
How are you going to get that person?
Okay, but I do. My answer would be, I don't know what else could do it. I really don't. maybe other rabbis, other teachers, other educators can do a better job than me, but I don't know what else can do. Okay, on that cheery note, yes?
And you said right at the outset, and you've repeated it several times, is we don't tell them. So what, how can they know when we don't tell them? We don't tell them all these positive things. So what are our non-Jewish day schools doing?
Could you please repeat the question?
What are our 9 Jewish day schools doing? The question was, I said, and there's a certain irony in the question being directed to me, that we don't tell them the positive reasons for being Jewish. So the question was, what are our 9 Jewish day schools? By the way, when you say 9, you're way behind the times. There's 12 now.
Okay.
Let me answer that in a number of ways. I actually think our Jewish day schools are doing a pretty good job. And I think, and I don't have to think, the evidence is overwhelming, that the likelihood of marrying out after a Jewish day school education is far lower than the likelihood of marrying out without that Jewish day school education. If you want to know why do we need Jewish day schools, that's a big part of the answer. And the reason that that's the case is, I think, our Jewish day schools, I can only speak with great authority for one, but I think the others are in a similar situation. We are doing that to some extent. We are doing that to a great extent. We are giving kids Jewish education. What the Jewish day schools are in Melbourne are all now doing, following the lead of one of them, I think, is investing in experiential, informal Jewish education. So it's not just about what the kids learn, it's what the kids do. And I think we are trying our best, and that sounds a bit lame, but I think we actually are succeeding in doing exactly what I was talking about, giving kids Jewish learning, giving kids the intellectual underpinning to Jewish life, and making it meaningful and beautiful and attractive. But, and this is something the report made very clear, and I wholly endorse this, we can't do it on our own. We cannot do it on our own. The repository of values that the children come to school with, they come with from the home. Now, in many cases, in my school, our parents are working with us, and they are supporting and endorsing the messages the kids get in school. But we also know that in all the schools, there are many parents who don't do that. There are many parents who either, in a sort of subconscious way by omission, or in a very deliberate way by commission, say to the child, you don't have to listen to anything you were taught at school. And although they taught you at school that Shabbat is important and nice, we're still going to go to the footy tonight. And we in the school can't control that. It's funny, we in school are assumed to take responsibility for a lot of things the children do over the weekend. I get calls every Monday morning from schools telling me they have behaved or they haven't behaved in shul at the mitzvah or something. And I point out, and this is a serious point, I say, thank you very much for that report, but the parents have to take some responsibility. Sometime during the week, the parents have actually got to be parents. And this applies in answer to your question. I'm not passing the buck, I'm sharing the buck. And when it comes to teaching the intrinsic importance, and this is the word I keep coming back to, the importance of Jewish life, at the end of the day, the parents can teach that more than the children, the school can. The parents teach it by example, the parents teach it by how they fill the time that the child's at home, by showing the child what's important, what's worth making sacrifices for, what's not, etc. So, when I say we, I'm speaking as a parent. When I say we are failing to tell our kids the importance of Jewish life, I'm speaking as a parent. I think we, as educators, are doing a pretty good job, but we can't do it on our own. Thank you for the question. Yes?
I think the schools do a very good job.
Thank you.
Parents, actually, the ones here who try and do a very good job. My problem isn't about parents or the teachers. My problem is, once the kids leave school, they leave the youth movement. And unfortunately, see, I believe it doesn't matter what youth movement, I don't believe in it school. I think if you're in any youth movement, you're going to be committed to it. But at the end of the day, when you're 25 to 30, and kids getting married later, there is nothing in this community that you go to.
Can you repeat the question?
This community as a whole, forget Mizrachi, forget wherever, this community, they've got nowhere to go, they've got nowhere to meet people, and you can't, unfortunately, meet them in a work situation. And guess what? Everybody goes to the gym.
Okay, the question was, or the observation was, number one, you said the school's doing a very good job. I'll endorse that. And you also said the parents are doing a very good job, or particularly the parents who are here. And I obviously am talking to a somewhat biased sample. But the problem is, you said after they leave school, after they leave youth movements, and you said whatever youth movement they'll become a committed Jew. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, unfortunately. I don't think every youth movement has an agenda of encouraging their children to be committed Jews, but that's for another discussion. But then you said, after they leave that environment, approximately the age of 18, what is there out for them?
It's up to university.
Well, I'd say it's before that. And I would say I totally agree. And it's something that I find very, on the one hand, almost perplexing, but very distressing. This community has 12 Jewish day schools, and it has youth groups, and it pours actually vast amounts of money into those schools and into those other activities for young people. But although our role in schools is very important, and those formative years are critical, in actual fact, the real decisions made by young people about what sort of Jewish life, if any, they're going to have, and in particular, what sort of Jewish home they're going to build for themselves and their own children, those decisions are made after they leave school. They're made at university, they're made in the 20-somethings, as you say, with people getting married later. That whole decade, and maybe even 18 to 35, that period of people's lives is possibly the most crucial in terms of helping them make the right Jewish choices. And broadly speaking, we as a community do nothing for that critical age group. Nothing. And, okay, at university, there's orgies, which runs on a shoestring. It does some good things. I'm not entirely sure of all of its activities. Chabad do a bit on campus, and there are one or two other tiny little outfits which are so small that nobody's heard of. Apart from that, there's nothing. I come from the United Kingdom, where there is a network of, a particular word is used, of chaplains serving all around the country. I had the privilege of being one a long time ago when I was like young, who were there particularly to give some sort of Jewish religious framework for kids on campus. And then there are, in London I'm thinking, and I also seen this in other places around the world, a whole host of learning, social, educational, religious, all sorts of activities particularly aimed at that post-university age group. And here we have nothing. And I think this really goes to the heart of the lack of strategic leadership and strategic direction in our community, because I think Melbourne is a wonderful, wonderful place, but if it had more of a strategic focus and allocation of resources in a strategic way, it would be even more wonderful, and that's what it doesn't have at the moment. And we are really, really letting down our 20-somethings, our early 30-somethings. We're not providing programming, people, resources, places, activities for them to stay engaged with Jewish life. And we should. We should desperately and urgently. Thank you.
But most of the kids at that age, 25, they've already come from where they're going to be coming from, and a lot of them have already made their own decision of what they want to do. You can't start training them at the age of 25.
I have to say, and by the way, Mazel Tov on your new Jewish grandchildren. I have to. The question was that at the age of 25, people have made their decisions. We can't start training them. I actually disagree, and I think particularly because people are getting married so late, and because for so many people, the decade of being a 20-something is just a time of experimentation before you find yourself at a later date. I think we have every opportunity to provide people and programs and activities and places for people throughout that decade to help them or to give them an opportunity to decide to make being Jewish an important part of their life and the life that they're going to build for themselves and their family. And I don't think 25 is too late at all. And I look at the examples of what happens in other parts of the world. I'm thinking particularly of London, where I lived for 2 years, and I'm thinking of other places where there are places which, and there are programs which really fill a Jewish need for people of 25 and much older. And there simply aren't those places here. And I think this is a major part of the problem. Yes?
You probably can't answer this, but I'll ask it anyway.
And lets me off the hook already.
You mentioned that at the turn of the last century, a lot of frum people found it terribly, terribly difficult to not work on Shabbat and that sort of thing. Now, before you purported to speak for God because you said God has written what he says in the book, so let me ask you, why did God make it so hard?
You're absolutely right. I can't answer that question. And I think to get on to the subject of God's plan for the world is probably going to take us way beyond our particular agenda tonight. So I will politely leave that as a good question. I'll take it on notice, okay? Why did God plan the world the way he did? But let me just say one thing. That the most effective way of showing that something is important is by making sacrifices for it. I'm not saying that's the answer to your question. But if we make sacrifices for something, then we are really showing ourselves and those around us it's important. Yes, sir?
I believe you're part of the rabbinic executive of this community. I think you're the secretary of the Rabbinical Council of Victoria.
For my sins.
In that role, what role do you think the rabbinic leadership should take in either welcoming the 40% of the community that are going to marry out, or in dealing with issues that you've raised tonight?
What role should the rabbis, the rabbinic leadership of the community take in dealing with the things I've raised tonight?
And can I extend it one more?
Yes, please.
Thing? If Jewish education in Jewish day schools is part of the answer to the solution, why aren't the rabbis yelling that from their pulpits? Why isn't that in the Jewish news every week?
I don't know exactly what the rabbis are yelling from their pulpits. I go to a shul where there's no rabbi in the pulpit. I go to a Kashkama meeting here and there's no rabbi. So I don't know. I don't know what the rabbis are yelling in their pulpits. I'm pretty sure that they are. Yeah, I know about yelling. I know yelling is never the best way to get ideas across. But I'm pretty sure that rabbis, and I can't speak for every rabbi in every shul, when they're engaging with couples, when they're engaging with families, they are talking about the importance of Jewish life, the importance of Jewish education, the importance of Jewish day school education.
Where are the programs welcoming, if 40% of the community is going to be marrying out, and I know that's, we've missed, to some degree, we've missed that opportunity. There's certainly, that's your opportunity to try and welcome some of those people back.
Well, again, I can't speak for particular rabbis and particular shuls, but I know of certain shuls which are creating all sorts of programs to reach out to the unaffiliated. I mean, by definition, reaching out to those who don't want to be reached out to or who've decided they no longer need to be reached out to is a big challenge. But I'm thinking of some of my rabbinic colleagues whom I have tremendous respect and admiration for the efforts they are making in their shuls and around their shuls to create programs, to create activities, to create meeting points for the less affiliated, the less connected. It's very, very hard, because if people, like we've heard already, if people have decided they don't want to be engaged, they don't want to be connected, then chances are a rabbi in a shul is not necessarily the first thing they're going to turn to. But I actually think that some of, at the risk of sounding ageist, the newer generation of rabbis are really seeing that reaching out to the disconnected as their priority. How much of a difference that makes, I don't know. Every one Jewish person brought back into the Jewish fold and re-engaged is a whole world and is a worthy achievement. And I know that's happening. So I think many rabbis are really doing the best and do see this as the #1 priority. Do you want to come back and qualify that?
I'm astounded that and I raised this with one of my colleagues, one of your colleagues, because I think the principals in this community who can clearly see that the Jewish day school movement is one of the major things, apart from the family, that is going to ensure the continuity of this community. That needs to be that. When the Jewish News prints ads for Lauriston, when the Jewish News prints ads for Wesley, there needs to be, and there used to be, there needs to be a resounding comment by the principals of the school, who are our representatives in that area, and probably by the lay leadership as well, to say this is not the way. If you keep on doing these things, if you keep on sending your Jewish children to Wesley and to Lauriston and to Shelford and to all these other wonderful day schools, you are ensuring, to some degree, that the children and the grandchildren won't be Jewish.
Okay. You've moved from the rabbis to the principals, and I happen to be in the intersection of both. So the question was, shouldn't the principals, it was originally rabbis and it was principals, to be doing more to be conveying the message that the Jewish day schools are critical for the community and the individual's future. Let me just say, by way of sort of avoiding the question but giving my own spin on it, I don't think today Lauriston and Wesley are our major competitors. Our major competitors are the public schools, and that is because one of the elephants in the room at the moment, when we get onto the subject of schools, is the ever-increasing burden of fees. And it is, I can hear the echo here, and it is a burden which an increasing number of families either are choosing not to shoulder or cannot shoulder. And I can tell you from my experience that the reason fees are high and are getting higher is because that's what it costs. Okay, my school certainly does not make a profit, it doesn't declare a dividend, and we charge parents what we have to in order to run the school. And let me just say that this is, I think, a major crisis. I keep using that word, but it's an appropriate word. It's a major crisis for this Jewish community, and this Jewish community must do something about it. And I don't know what is the solution. I have a few ideas, but I usually get shot down for raising them, so I won't, certainly not in this particular building. But it must do something. And that's what I talked also, I referred earlier to the lack of strategic leadership of this community that will drive solutions and will drive ways of channeling resources into dealing with this particular issue, which I think is probably the biggest of all. Okay, yes?
You mentioned that in other countries in the world there are activities focused on this. What are they? For example, in England, how are they managing it in England?
Well, I'm not saying they're solving it in England.
No.
It also has a ridiculously, a tragically high rate of intermarriage, which is higher than here. But I look in London and I look at their activities. Let's say social activities, educational activities, religious activities, learning activities, which are designed specifically for that university and post-university age group.
But who is doing that?
Different organisations. There's more organisations to
Well, let me ask you a different question. What organisation here in Melbourne could do that?
What organisation here in Melbourne could do that?
Or is there an organisation in Melbourne that could do it?
At the risk of going down too many different avenues, especially when I'm prepared, and I've probably already got myself into it, I don't think there are organisations at the moment, or if they are, they're so small as to be insignificant. I think Chabad is probably the one organisation that could claim to be doing that, and I think Chabad does a wonderful job, but with one particular focus. And I think it's unfortunate that there aren't other organisations with a different focus trying to do the same thing. And perhaps because one organisation's got a monopoly, that itself is a problem. I think there needs to be a reconsideration of our priorities. And I think one of the facets of this community, as I've already said twice, not having a strategic overall direction, is that if people want to do things, they try and raise the money, and then they do it. Or they fail to raise the money, and then they don't do it. We don't, as a community, say, this is where our money should be spent. Sydney has a JCA, a Jewish Communal Appeal, which to some extent does that. And it also employs people to research and to sit and think about the future of the community. We don't have that. And nowhere do we have an opportunity to say, this is so important, this must have money spent on it, let's now get the money. That's not how this community works, and I think it's unfortunate.
So really what you're saying is we don't have a community in the sense that we're not all together and therefore able to marshal the issue, the resources.
Let me just say this. Often people like me say the community should do this, the community should do that. The trouble with that is, in that respect, there isn't a community. There is no address for the community when someone like me says we should be doing this. There's no address to make that point to. So in that respect, there isn't a community. Of course, that's a pretty harsh thing to say, and that's why I have to qualify what I mean by that. But in terms of somebody or some organisation to take responsibility for what's important, for what is a priority, that's what we're lacking. Yes.
Isn't the council also a synagogue?
JCC.
It's JCC.
last week or so. I think it was Z, I get confused with all the Z organisation. And they're starting up something for the 25 to 35-year-old group. They're starting a pilot now for 2 years, people who were involved in youth movement. They're taking in the moment people who were very involved and using them as a pilot group. And then they're organising a number of functions a year and then moving on and seeing how that goes. And there's also now the Mizrachi House, which is very in. Now we're going to have 3 couples from that. So that's also, I think a lot of the time it's about, finding somebody, people just to socialise with. It's not necessarily, as you were saying, that people are going out to find non-Jewish partners, but when you're mid to late 20s, it's better to have someone to know one a lot of the time. And so I think the Mizrachi House is very good. But I was going to ask you, in terms, the Mizrachi House is like 5 young people or so, 4 or 5 young people who all live together. Their rent is very subsidised, and they have to put on 60 functions a year. So it's 5 functions a month. They have a whole lot of different functions, very pluralistic, and there are hundreds of people at most functions that I've been to. And it's an absolute cross-section of Jews, absolutely. And I was going to ask you about conversion, and if at some point, if conversion became a bit easier, I think that there are also people who would like to convert, and a lot of the time the system can seem quite hostile, and that might be wrong, but in some cases it has been seen as hostile. And I wonder if making the process slightly easier, not necessarily like don't make border and making it quite that easy, but if making the system a little bit easier or a bit more approachable might change in some cases.
Okay, what was just said was a couple of rays of hope. Number one, we just learned that the ZYC, the Zionist Council of Victoria, the ZCV, is, I didn't know about this, is organising activities specifically aimed at the 25 to 35 group, taking people who have been previously heavily involved in youth movements and using them as the nucleus to encourage others. That sounds very positive. Although you're right that to some extent this is a simple problem of Jewish lad and Jewish lass not meeting each other. And if we can create environments for them to do so, then that's going to help. I think that's very true, but it needs to be more than that. Okay? And it goes back to what I said about the meaning and the beauty and the truth of what it's all about. So it's not just about social events, and that's why when people ask me about what's happening in my experience in London, it's not just social events, there's something that's got to underpin that as well. For those who didn't hear, and for those who don't know, Mizrachi House is, I'm not quite sure if it's an organisation or just very, very fluid and loose, but people are financing houses all over the world, and now it's come to Melbourne, where 5 people are given the opportunity to live in a very subsidised way in a particular house, on condition that they put on activities for people of their own age to create some sort of centre of Jewish life for that age group, and that's a very, very positive development. But then the question was, would people be more likely to convert if it were easier? I'm going to answer in a way that sounds like I'm being ultra-diplomatic, but actually is my genuine answer. I think conversion should be easy and welcoming, as long as it fulfills the halakhic requirements of conversion. I am not a dayan. I am not an expert in the halakhic requirements of conversion. I will therefore leave that to the dayanim who are. Next question. Yes?
We're still leaving out that post-school, early university, those very, very vulnerable years. Okay, so it's very nice to hear this. We've talked about the schools, but yet that critical 3, 4, 5-year period, where, especially coming from Scopers, I went to Scopers, that's the first contact with the, in many ways, to the outside world. And young people are vulnerable. You would remember, because you from England, you probably on campus there was the Hillel movement, okay, which looked after that, which I don't know the history of it here, but I think somehow it fizzled out because of lack of funds. It was successful, it did work, and it looks like Chabad is trying to fill that gap where Hillel did play an important role and, if you like, protected young people and provided a corridor, if you like, for learning more about themselves after school. And maybe you, because you're on the Rabbinical Council, could comment about what happened to Hillel all over. I think, I don't hear of Hillel on campuses much more.
I'm afraid I couldn't, because I don't know the story. It's not before my time.
College days, from your university.
My own college days?
Yeah.
It's going back a long way. In the United Kingdom, I think based on the American model, there was an organisation, it was actually a subset of B'nai B'rith called Hillel, and it set up Hillel houses in pretty much every campus. And some were very small and some were very large, and some were just a dormitory, and some were, well, I think all were to some extent, a centre of Jewish activity. And the University Jewish Society would use that as its base, and the chaplain would use that as his base, and there was a physical place, but also a series of events which would come out of that Hillel house. Now, of course, a crucial difference in Melbourne is that very few of our students live away from home while they are students. So the whole idea of it being residential and it being available evenings, weekends, 24/7, is much less relevant to our students here today. Students here, to my amazement, seem to all have full-time jobs while they're students. I've never quite worked out how they balance, but somehow they do. And of course, the students now tell me, since all the lectures are online, and you can listen to them in the great comfort of your own home at double speed, it's much more efficient not to go into campus at all, but to stay at home. Even further separating the students from the campus. So the fact that our students do not live on campus and do not have that whole campus experience, which is probably a good thing, by the way, but that changes the way we reach out to them and the way they access us and we access them. Having said that, all I can do, I have no knowledge to offer on this particular subject. I can only wholeheartedly agree that we need to be providing programs, people, facilities for that age group. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more critical than the 20-something, because I already said I think that's critical as well. But you're certainly right that we need to be out there on the universities. We need to have good people, good educators out there on the universities to be, as you very nicely put it, to be a corridor for people to channel their Jewish engagement and their Jewish decisions through.
And perhaps bring back campus rabbis.
Perhaps bring back campus rabbis, but the problem is, who's going to pay for it?
Then
That's where these things fall down.
Well, there you are. But again, that's a very necessary part of funding.
I agree.
Having community funding.
Having previously served as a campus rabbi at the University of Leeds myself a long time ago, I'm very aware how important that is and how much of a hole we have in our provision that we don't provide that. I think I've got time for one more question. There's one over here, one over there. I'll get these both in if you keep them fairly quick. Yes, sir.
Many of my friends, being in the sort of age group that you've been discussing, have the strategy that if they find things are getting too difficult, they plan on leaving Melbourne, leaving Australia, and moving to Israel, making Aliyah, in order to overcome some of these challenges. This is something that you didn't mention at all, and I was wondering if it's something that you don't advocate specifically, and if there's a reason not to do it, in your opinion, or if there is just a reason to do it.
I didn't mention it because I didn't think it was really relevant to what I was talking about, which is what we do for our children. But you ask about, would I advocate going to Israel as a solution to these problems? The answer is an unequivocal yes, and very strongly. I think living in Israel, in terms of this particular issue, living in Israel is not always a guarantor of Jewish continuity. And things can happen in Israel that we wouldn't have anticipated, we wouldn't have wanted, but it increases the chances of Jewish grandchildren, if we measure it by that, 100-fold. That's not the main reason to go and live in Israel. The main reason to go and live in Israel is because it's a mitzvah, and it's because it's the centre of Jewish life and the centre of Jewish destiny in our times. And I would wholeheartedly advocate people of any age, but particularly of a younger age, going to live in Israel. So if I omitted to say that, let me clarify that now. I'm very, very much in favour of that. And the last question was over here. I promised I'd give a go. Yes?
What would you do if your child brought home a non-Jewish friend?
What would I do if my child brought home a non-Jewish friend? I shouldn't have asked you that question.
Nothing you specifically.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant me specifically. I was going to say, I don't know. I know I would be heartbroken. It would be a terrible, terrible challenge for me. I don't know what I would do. And how you get the balance right between loving your child, showing you are a good human being to everyone else, including the non-Jewish person, and yet making clear that this is something that you strongly disapprove of, and why you strongly disapprove of, and that's what I said earlier, so crucial and so essential. How you get that balance right, I don't know. I hope I'm never in that situation, and if I were to be in that situation, then I don't know how I'd respond. That's the best answer I can give you. And I think on that very honest answer, I will draw these things to a close.